In 1694, England was nearly bankrupt. The country had just fought a long and costly war against France. The treasury was empty. The king needed money, and no one wanted to lend it to him, not at any reasonable rate. Then a group of London merchants came forward with a proposal. They would form a private bank. That bank would lend the government £2 million. In return, the government would pay them interest every year. And the bank would receive the right to issue paper currency. It was called the Bank of England. 300 years later, that institution still exists. And the arrangement behind it, governments borrowing from private lenders in exchange for regular interest payments, became the foundation of how nearly every state on earth manages its finances. Here is the part that surprises most people. The original debt from 1694 was never fully repaid in the traditional sense. It was rolled over, extended, refinanced. New borrowing replaced old borrowing. The principal did not disappear. It transformed into something else, a permanent fixture in the financial landscape. Most people grow up believing that debt must eventually be paid off, that borrowing is temporary, that the bill always comes due. But for governments, the story has been different for a very long time. The question worth asking is not whether governments repay debt. The real question is how they built a system where continuous borrowing became normal, trusted, and financially stable across generations. That is what this video is about. Long before the Bank of England, long before stock markets and bond traders, rulers borrowed money. This was not unusual. War was expensive, harvests failed, tax revenue arrived unevenly. A king who needed to pay soldiers in October could not always wait for tax collections in December. So rulers turned to merchants. In medieval Europe, wealthy traders in cities like Florence, Genoa, and Venice had the cash that monarchs lacked. They became informal lenders to kings and princes. These were not charity arrangements. The merchants charged interest, sometimes high interest, and expected to be repaid. But repayment was often unreliable. Rulers defaulted. They died and left their heirs unwilling to honor old promises. They simply refused to pay when it suited them. Edward III of England famously defaulted on his debts to Florentine banking families in the 14th century. Several of those families went bankrupt as a result. Early sovereign borrowing was risky, for both sides. Over time, something began to shift. The Italian city-states of the 14th and 15th centuries started developing more structured forms of public debt. Venice, in particular, created something called the prestiti, forced loans from wealthy citizens that paid regular interest. Citizens could trade these loan certificates to each other. This made the debt liquid, transferable, valuable. That was a quiet but important development. When debt can be traded, it becomes an asset. It stops being just a favor owed by a ruler. It becomes a financial instrument. And financial instruments attract investors. The city of Genoa built similar structures. So did the cities of northern Italy and later the towns of the Low Countries. These were small experiments, but they planted an idea. If a state had reliable tax revenue and a trustworthy system for collecting it, then lending to that state was not so different from any other investment. The state's ability to tax its citizens was, in effect, its collateral. This connection between taxation and borrowing would become the organizing logic of sovereign finance for centuries to come. By the late 16th and early 17th centuries, the Dutch Republic had become the most financially sophisticated economy in the world. Amsterdam was the center of global trade. The Dutch East India Company, the VOC, was one of the first publicly traded corporations. The Amsterdam Exchange Bank stabilized the currency. The city had functioning capital markets where money moved fluidly between investors, merchants, and institutions. The Dutch government borrowed at interest rates lower than almost anywhere else in Europe. That was not a coincidence. Low borrowing costs came from high investor confidence. And investor confidence came from the Dutch Republic's track record of honoring its debts, collecting its taxes, and maintaining stable institutions. Lenders trusted that they would be paid back, or at least paid their regular interest, because the system that backed those promises was genuinely functional. This gave the Dutch a structural advantage in warfare and commerce alike. They could borrow cheaply to fund naval expeditions and military campaigns. Their rivals paid more, borrowed less, and fought at a disadvantage. England watched this carefully. When the Bank of England was established in 1694, it was not merely a financial experiment. It was a deliberate attempt to copy the Dutch model and apply it to an English context. The arrangement worked like this. The Bank of England lent money to the government. The government issued bonds, essentially promises to pay interest at regular intervals. Investors bought those bonds. The bonds could be traded on the open market. and the whole system was underpinned by Parliament's authority to levy taxes and guarantee repayment. Parliament mattered here, a great deal. Before the Glorious Revolution of 1688, English monarchs had frequently overridden financial agreements when it suited them. Charles II had suspended debt repayments in what became known as the Stop of the Exchequer in 1672. Investors had long memories. Parliamentary control over taxation changed the trust calculation. If Parliament, a body representing the propertied classes and major creditors, had to approve all tax measures and all major borrowing decisions, then investors could be more confident that agreements would be honored. A king could not unilaterally walk away from a debt if Parliament had sanctioned it. This institutional check created credibility, and credibility lowered the cost of borrowing. England went on to fight a long series of expensive wars: the War of Spanish Succession, the 7 Years' War, the American Revolutionary War, and eventually the Napoleonic Wars. Each war produced enormous debt. After each war, the debt was not fully repaid. It was consolidated, restructured, and carried forward. The British government issued what became known as consolidated government bonds with no fixed repayment date. The government paid interest indefinitely. The bonds traded on the open market. Investors were satisfied as long as the interest kept arriving. The debt became, in effect, permanent, but it did not destabilize the economy. It became part of it. What allowed this system to function across generations was not magic or luck. It was a set of interlocking conditions that reinforced each other. The first was reliable taxation. A government that can consistently collect taxes has a predictable income stream. That income stream can service debt, meaning it can pay the regular interest owed to bondholders. As long as the interest is paid, investors have little reason to demand early repayment. The system keeps moving. The second was institutional trust. Lenders need to believe that the rules will not change overnight. They need to know that a government cannot simply cancel its obligations. The development of parliamentary systems, central banks, and financial laws created durable frameworks that persisted beyond any individual ruler or minister. Trust is slow to build, but once built, it functions like infrastructure. The third was liquid bond markets. When government bonds can be freely bought and sold, investors do not need to wait decades for repayment. They can sell their bonds whenever they need cash. This makes government debt a far more attractive investment than a private loan that cannot be transferred. Liquid markets also allowed new debt to replace old debt smoothly. When an old bond matured, the government could issue a new one. Investors who wanted to stay invested rolled over their money. Others sold and exited. The overall debt level stayed stable or grew, but no single repayment event caused a crisis. The fourth was investor interest. Government bonds became core holdings for banks, insurance companies, merchant firms, and wealthy individuals. Owning government debt was not merely profitable, it was considered safe, stable. A way to preserve wealth across generations. This created a feedback loop. As more investors held government bonds, they had a vested interest in the government's financial stability. A state that defaulted would damage the portfolios of the very institutions that supported its economy. Investors and governments became financially interdependent. The debt did not sit outside the economy. It was woven into the economy. Banks held government bonds as reserves. Insurance companies used bond income to pay claims. Pension funds matched long-term liabilities with long-term government debt. The state's ability to borrow became, in a real sense, a public good shared across the financial system. These patterns did not stay confined to England or the Dutch Republic. Across the 18th and 19th centuries, similar structures emerged in different national contexts. France developed its own long-term bond market through instruments called rents, perpetual annuities, that paid interest indefinitely with no fixed repayment obligation. The French state carried heavy debt through Revolution, Empire, and Restoration. The debt changed form many times, but the mechanism of borrowing through tradable instruments persisted. In the United States, Alexander Hamilton made a decisive early argument. He proposed that the new federal government should assume the war debts of the individual states. This was controversial. Many opposed it, but Hamilton's reasoning was clear. A government that honors its debts builds creditworthiness. Creditworthiness lowers future borrowing costs. Lower borrowing costs give the state more flexibility in peacetime and in crisis. The long-term benefit outweighed the short-term burden. His argument prevailed, and the federal debt became a cornerstone of American financial development. In Britain, the bonds issued to finance the Napoleonic Wars carried interest for nearly 2 centuries. Some of those bonds, the old consols, were not fully redeemed until 2015. The debt was not a failure. It was simply carried as a long-term cost of maintaining a global financial and military presence. Japan, Prussia, and the Austro-Hungarian Empire developed their own variations of the same model. Each adapted the core logic to its own institutions and tax systems. The pattern was consistent: build a reliable tax base, establish institutions that make financial promises credible, develop a market for government debt, and let the debt become a permanent feature of the financial landscape rather than a temporary emergency measure. What varied was execution. The outcomes differed considerably depending on how well each of these conditions was met. States that maintained strong institutions and reliable taxation could borrow repeatedly over long periods without financial crisis. States that failed to maintain those conditions faced defaults, market panic, and collapsed credit. The system rewarded stability. It punished uncertainty. The long arc of sovereign debt history points toward a simple but important idea. For modern governments, debt is not primarily about consumption or recklessness. It is a structural feature of how states manage time. Governments spend before they collect. They invest ahead of returns. They borrow during crises and repay gradually during calmer periods, or sometimes they do not repay at all, but simply maintain the debt at a manageable level relative to the size of the economy. The question of full repayment in this context is almost the wrong question. The right question is whether the system remains credible, whether investors believe the interest will be paid, whether the institutions that underpin the promises remain functional, whether the tax base is broad enough and strong enough to service the obligations. When all of those conditions hold, the system continues. Debt rolls over. New bonds replace old ones. The market remains liquid. Borrowing costs stay low. And the government retains the financial flexibility it needs to respond to whatever comes next. This is not a recent invention. It did not emerge from modern economics textbooks. It was built incrementally over several centuries by institutions that had strong practical incentives to make long-term borrowing work. Merchants needed safe places to invest surplus capital. Governments needed reliable access to funds beyond their tax revenues. Central banks needed to manage liquidity in the financial system. Bond markets needed instruments that were stable, tradable, and backed by credible guarantors. Each of these needs pointed in the same direction. The result was a system in which states and financial markets grew deeply dependent on each other, each providing something the other could not easily replace. That relationship, built quietly across centuries of deals, wars, and financial crises, is what makes it possible for governments to borrow today, tomorrow, and across the generations that follow. It is less about debt and more about trust. If you found this video useful, consider subscribing. New videos on economic and financial history are released regularly. Leave a comment below if there is a specific topic you would like explored next.